In a previous presentation, I discussed the general process of publishing a research paper in social sciences. In today's presentation, I would like to share with you the general structure of a research paper and the general contents of a research paper in social sciences. So first, let's start with the general structure of a research paper in social sciences. This is the general structure of a research paper in social sciences, and generally these 9 parts are there in the general social science research paper, beginning with the title page, then followed by the introduction and background, and then the literature review, the methodology section, the findings and results section, the discussion section, the implications section, the conclusion, and references or appendices and acknowledgement section. Now we will discuss what are the contents of these general sections of the research paper. So the title page actually is an essential part of the research paper, and this generally includes the title of the research paper, it also has the author's names and affiliations and other information when it is actually published in the journal. The journal name and the issue and the volume number and the date, etc. are also mentioned on the title page. Then the introduction and background section is actually an introduction to the topic. So what is the topic about, and what is a brief background of the topic? Generally, what definitions are involved in the topic, then what are the objectives and the research questions related to the topic. So generally the word limit for this section, the introduction and background section, will vary from around 400 to 500 words to around 800, and in some cases 1000 words. This is then followed by the literature review section, which is in some cases the introduction and background and literature review sections are combined in certain papers following the requirements of specific journals. But in many cases, the literature review part is a distinct part, a separate part in the research paper. And in this section, there is critical analysis of previously published work on this subject. The literature review involves the description of previous studies, previous literature, the analysis of that, and evaluation of that, and then a synthesis of the previous studies or findings from previous studies. The important characteristics of this part is that it should be objective and it should be comprehensive, which actually means that it gives adequate background and scholarly insights into the research topic to the reader. This also leads to gap identification, although a preliminary gap has already been identified in the beginning or introduction part of the paper. But this consolidates the gap that the knowledge gap or the scholarship gap that the researcher wants to fill through this research. And so this research gap is then analyzed, and this leads to a rationale for further exploration and filling of the scholarship gap or the knowledge gap. So generally this is a very comprehensive part, a very important part that gives in-depth understanding related to the topic, to the background of the topic, to the various debates or argument related to the topic. And because this is a bit extensive, so generally it will vary between 1000 words to 1500 words. In some cases, keeping in view the requirements of particular journals or the requirements of particular topics, this word limit might be more than a few thousand words. And then this is followed by the methodology section, which is the fourth section of the research paper generally. And in this section, there is a description of the research design, the sample, the data collection tools and processes, the data analysis processes, the authentication, or in other words, the validity, reliability issues, and ethical considerations. These are the concepts that are explored, that are actually presented in the methodology section. And generally, what, why, and how are the three important questions that are responded to in this section, which actually means what research design is adopted, why is that research design adopted, and how was that research design implemented. Similarly, what sample was used, why was that sample used, and how was the sample selected, how was the data collected, and similarly, what data analysis methods were used and why were those used. So the why questions in this section is very important. You are not just giving the description of the methodological considerations, but also you need to, in most cases, you need to rationalize, critically evaluate and rationalize the choice of the method that you have been using in your research, whether it's the research design, whether it's data collection or analysis methods, or whether it's steps related to the ethical considerations, the validity, reliability issues. So generally, this section, again keeping in view the requirements of particular journals and particular topics, this section might vary between 400 to 500 words to 1000 words, and in some cases this might be more, especially in experimental type of researches, where there is deeper description and detail of the research methodology is needed. Now we are moving to the last part of the presentation, and that is the fifth section and onwards to the end of the presentation. So the fifth section then is the findings and results section. What is this section? In this section, the findings or our results are presented. So the findings could be quantitative and they might be presented in the form of tables. The findings might be qualitative, and so they might be presented in textual form. And so the important thing is that these findings should be substantial, they should be clearly presented, and in order to clearly present findings, we need to present findings keeping in view our research objectives and research questions. So while presenting the findings, we need to look back at what were our objectives or what were our research questions. These actually give structure to the findings that we get. So again, there will be some variation, but generally the findings section of a research paper revolves around between 1000 words to 1500 words, and in some cases about 2000 words. Then comes the discussion section. This is also an essential part in most research papers, where the readers or the evaluators expect the researchers to not only give their findings but also to discuss their findings in the light of previous studies. And so there is this critical evaluation, critical analysis of the findings, and so the findings need to be discussed so that we understand what actually the findings mean to the researcher and what do actually the findings mean in terms of the scholarship that has been produced through this research. So the discussion again is on the main findings of the research paper, and the word limit might vary from 500 words to 1,000 words. Again, there will be some variation across disciplines and keeping in view the requirements of the research journals. Then the implication section is actually, we also expect the researchers to give possible implications of the significant findings or results of the study. So what do the findings then, the overall findings or the conclusions mean to the researcher, and what do they mean in terms of their value to the development of theory and practice or informing practice? So what are the practical theoretical implications of the research? This is a section that is generally included, and this section generally revolves between 300 to 500 words. Again, there will be slight variation. Then the conclusion section is overall. So now, what do you overall as a researcher, what do you conclude from this whole process? Which actually means that the what, why, and how of the whole research process. And so what did you get towards the end, and what do you conclude, what do you give, what did you get out of the research paper, and what did you give to the research field in which you have conducted this particular research. So that will be the general conclusion of the research paper. And then towards the end, we need to have the references section, because most research papers have a reference or citation list. This actually is a process of authentication, because the background, the literature review, the methodology section will have certain citations that you need to refer to in the references section to give full references to those sources from which you have actually got insights from. And then in some papers there is acknowledgement, especially acknowledgements where there is some contribution from people other than authors, or there is funding involved in the process. So in that case as well, there is acknowledgements. And in some cases there are appendices as well, although this is rare, because the journals generally do not require appendices because they have limited space, and appendices are generally larger documents such as questionnaires or interview schedules. But in some cases you might also need to include appendices in your research paper. So this was the general structure and content of the research paper, and of course there might be certain variations keeping in view the requirements of the particular academic field or the particular research journals. Here what we discussed was the general structure and contents of a research paper in social sciences. Thank you very much.